Things to note for would to talk about the past. There are a few important things that we need to note when using would to talk about the past. I mentioned in the previous lecture, would and used to are very, very similar. However, there are some very slight differences which we'll go through in just a moment. Let's look at the first thing that we have to note when using this grammar. When using would to talk about the past, we need a time reference. Look at the example below. Remember when we were at university, we would go partying every night and come home in the morning for our first lecture. So in this example, the underlined part is a time reference. He's giving a time in the past that he's talking about, when we were at university. So when we use would to talk about the past, we must use a time reference in our sentence. This is very important to remember. You must include a time reference. Otherwise, your sentence won't make much sense. If I simply say, I would go to the park every day, the listener won't know when I'm talking about. They'll be very confused. But if I say, as a teenager, I would go to the park every day. Now we've got a time reference, as a teenager. The listener knows, aha, you're talking about the past. You're using would to talk about the past. So a time reference is key when using this grammar. Now let's look at the slight difference between would and used to. Compare used to and would. With used to, a time reference is optional. However, with would, it is necessary. Look at this first example. We used to go to the local park every evening and play football. Just from reading this sentence, we know this person is talking about sometime in the past. We don't need a time reference. Look at the next example. During our secondary school days, we would go to the local park every evening and play football. Because we've used would in this sentence, we need the time reference during our secondary school days. This is important. If we didn't include this time reference, the sentence wouldn't make much sense. Here are some common time phrases that you can use when using would to talk about the past. You can use during, for example, during the 1980s, during the war, during my school years. You can use the phrase when I was younger, when I was at school, when I was living in Spain, for example. You can use the phrase while we were in school, while we were living in Spain, while we were working at this company, etc. You can use at school, or at university, for example. You can use every time I saw you, or every time we met, or every time we went somewhere. And you can use whenever you did something, or whenever we went somewhere. So use these time phrases before you use would to talk about the past. There's a nice selection of time phrases for you. Try to think of some examples about your own life using those time phrases. So think about something you did regularly in the past, when you were at school, when you were working at a particular company, when you lived somewhere else, for example. Try to think of your own examples. Now there's one more little difference between would and used to. Let's have a look at it now. Don't use would when talking about past states. A state is a verb that isn't an action. For example, love, live, or have, etc. Only use would to talk about past habits and behaviors, which are actions. So look at this example below. I would get up at 1 p.m. every day when I was at university. Get up is a habit, an action, which means would is perfectly fine to use. However, look at the next sentence. If we use would here, it doesn't make sense. So we can't say, I would have blonde hair when I was at university. Have in this sentence is a state, so we cannot use would. Instead, we should use used to. With used to, you can use states or actions. So with this state, we should use used to. I used to have blonde hair when I was at university. So just remember, would to talk about the past is only used to talk about actions, not states. If you want to talk about states, such as love or hate, then use used to. So you couldn't say, when I was younger, I would hate vegetables, because hate is a state. It's better to use used to. When I was younger, I used to hate vegetables. Okay, so keep that in mind. There's one more thing we have to look at, and it's this. When we use would to talk about the past, we only use the positive form. So we generally only use would to talk about the past in the positive. We don't really use wouldn't in this case. So we wouldn't usually say, when I was at school, I wouldn't study maths. It doesn't really make sense. Instead, if you have a negative, just use used to. In this example, you can say, when I was at school, I didn't used to study maths. Okay, so didn't used to is the negative form for this. We don't use wouldn't. Now move on to the speaking and listening practice exercises. Make sure you download the MP3 as well. Listen to it as much as you can.